The dust of Redemption Creek didn't just settle on your boots. It settled on your soul. It was a fine, gritty powder the color of rust and regret, kicked up by the unforgiving wind that swept down from the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains. It coated everything: the raw lumber of the storefronts, the watering troughs where weary horses drank, and the spirits of the people who called this hardscrabble patch of Colorado home. It was in this dust that Alara fell. The world didn't so much fade as it fractured. The sounds of the town, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shrill laughter of women by the mercantile, the gruff calls of men loading a wagon splintering, into 1,000 sharp, incoherent pieces. One moment she was standing, her hand pressed against the small, insistent swell of her belly. The next, the world tilted on its axis. The sun, a merciless white eye in the vast pale sky, burned a final, searing image into her mind before darkness took her. It was the face of the sheriff, a man whose features seemed carved from granite in contempt, his eyes narrowing as he watched her stumble. There was no pity there, only judgment. Her knees hit the ground first, a dull, jarring thud that sent a shockwave of pain through her already aching body. A collective gasp rippled through the town square, a sound like a single startled breath. Then silence. A heavy, watchful quiet that was somehow louder than the noise it had replaced. They stared. The women in their starched bonnets, their mouths tightening into thin, disapproving lines. The men, their hands stilling on their work, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and detached pity. They saw not a woman, but a scandal, a problem. Alara, the bride left at the altar just 2 months prior, her belly now a rounding testament to a love that had proven to be a lie. Her betrothed, a charming gambler with eyes the color of a summer sky, had vanished with the dawn, leaving behind only a pile of debts and the whispers that followed her like a shadow. She had tried. God, she had tried. She took in laundry until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. She scrubbed floors in the saloon until the stench of stale whiskey and cheap perfume clung to her hair. But the town had a long memory and a short supply of compassion. Doors began to close. The laundry pile dwindled. The saloon owner, a man with greasy hair and wandering hands, told her she was becoming a distraction. Her savings, meager to begin with, evaporated like a puddle in the July sun. The hunger had started as a dull ache, a familiar companion. But now it was a ravenous beast, clawing at her insides, stealing her strength, her will, her very consciousness. As she lay in the dust, the world a muffled, distant roar, a single desperate thought pierced through the fog. My baby. Please. God, not my baby. It was a prayer without words, a raw cry from the deepest part of her being. The dust was hot against her cheek, gritty on her lips. She could feel the vibrations of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. A shadow fell over her, blocking out the cruel sun. She braced herself for the sheriff's rough hands, for the humiliation of being dragged away like a piece of trash. She had seen it happen to others. Redemption Creek had its own brand of justice, swift and merciless. But the hands that touched her were not the sheriff's. They were large, calloused, yet surprisingly gentle. One hand slid beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lifted from the ground with an ease that spoke of immense, quiet strength. The movement was so fluid, so unexpected, that a weak, confused sound escaped her lips. Through a slit of vision, she saw a flannel shirt, faded and worn. The scent of pine, leather, and clean earth filled her senses, a stark contrast to the sour smell of the town. She tried to see the face of the man who held her, but her vision swam, the world a blur of light and shadow. A voice, low and rough as riverstone, cut through the thick silence of the square. She's coming with me. It was not a request. It was a statement. An unbreakable declaration that sent a fresh shockwave through the assembled crowd. The sheriff took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Now hold on, Silas. You don't know what you're getting into. I know what she is, the man named Silas said, his voice unwavering. She's a woman who needs help. And in this town, it seems that's a crime. He didn't raise his voice, but the words carried a weight that made the sheriff pause. Silas turned his head slightly, and for a moment, his eyes met the lawman's. Alara, in her semi-conscious state, couldn't see the expression on his face, but she felt the sheriff flinch as if struck. Without another word, Silas began to walk, carrying her as if she weighed nothing at all. He moved with a long, steady stride, away from the center of the town, away from the staring eyes and the venomous whispers that had already begun to swirl in his wake. Who does he think he is? That's Silas Blackwood, the recluse from up on Shadow Ridge. Lost his wife and child a few years back. He's taking in that woman? He's a fool. Ilara felt the gentle sway of his walk, the solid, steady beat of his heart against her ear. It was the first steady thing she had felt in months. The world was a dizzying kaleidoscope of pain and confusion, but in the circle of this stranger's arms, there was a small, quiet pocket of safety. As he carried her past the last of the town's buildings and onto the open road that led into the foothills, the darkness finally claimed her completely. Her last conscious thought was not of fear or shame or even the gnawing hunger. It was a question, faint and fragile as a moth's wing, that fluttered in the ruins of her mind. Who are you? He was Silas Blackwood, a man carved from the same granite as the mountains that loomed over his ranch. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, etched with lines of grief and solitude. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a deep, abiding sadness that he rarely allowed anyone to see. It had been 5 years since the fever had taken his Sarah and their little boy, Caleb. 5 years of silence, broken only by the wind in the pines and the lowing of his cattle. He had retreated into himself, building walls around his heart so thick and high that no one in Redemption Creek even tried to scale them anymore. He was a ghost, a local legend, the man who had lost everything and wanted nothing. And yet, he had walked into town for supplies, a trip he made only when absolutely necessary, and had seen her fall. He had seen the smug satisfaction on the sheriff's face, the cold judgment in the eyes of the women. He had seen her desperation, the fierce, protective way her hand had rested on her belly even as she collapsed. And something inside him, a part of him he thought long dead and buried, had stirred. It wasn't pity. It was a different kind of ache. A recognition. He knew what it was to be alone, to be judged, to have the world turn its back on you. In her, he saw a reflection of his own shattered soul. The decision to pick her up had not been a decision at all. It was an instinct, a primal pull he couldn't explain and didn't try to. He carried her all the way to his ranch, a 2-mile trek that would have winded most men. The cabin was small, sturdy, built by his own hands. It was a place of deep shadows and deeper memories. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the cold hearth. Caleb's small wooden horse was on the mantelpiece. For 5 years, he had preserved it as a shrine, a testament to a life that had been stolen from him. Now he was bringing a stranger into this sacred, silent space, a pregnant stranger. The irony was a bitter pill in his throat. He laid her gently on his own bed, the one he hadn't shared since Sarah's last breath. She was pale, her skin almost translucent. Her dress, though clean, was worn thin, the fabric a testament to her poverty. He looked at the swell of her stomach, and a fresh wave of grief, sharp and unexpected, washed over him. He had once waited, with joyful anticipation for a child of his own. He had imagined holding his son, teaching him to ride, to work the land. Now he was looking at another man's child, a child who was as much an outcast as its mother. He moved with a quiet efficiency born of long practice. He stoked the embers in the stove, adding fresh wood until a gentle warmth began to fill the room. He ladled broth from a pot he'd left simmering, the smell of venison and wild herbs a welcome contrast to the sterile air. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently lifted her head. "Can you drink?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been in the town square. Ilara's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade of green, like moss after a spring rain, but they were clouded with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, a panicked look on her face. Who? "Easy," he said, his large hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You're safe. You collapsed. I brought you here." He held the spoon to her lips. "It's just broth. You need to eat." She stared at him, her eyes wide, taking in his weathered face, his immense size, the raw power that seemed to emanate from him. Fear warred with a desperate, all-consuming hunger. Her pride, what little she had left, screamed at her to refuse, to run. But her body, betrayed by starvation, had other ideas. The smell of the broth was intoxicating. She parted her lips, and he carefully tipped the spoon, the warm, savory liquid a balm to her raw throat. He gave her another spoonful, and then another, his movements slow and patient, as if he were tending to a frightened fawn. When the bowl was empty, she sank back against the pillows, a measure of strength returning to her limbs. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a profound sense of exhaustion. She looked around the cabin, at the simple masculine furnishings, the lingering ghosts of a life that was not her own. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why did you help me?" Silas stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. He stared out at the vast, lonely expanse of his land, the rolling hills golden in the late afternoon sun. "Because I know what it is to have nothing left," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear him. "And no one should have to face that. Alone." He didn't turn around. He didn't offer false comfort or easy promises. He just stood there, a solitary figure framed against the wilderness, his words hanging in the quiet air between them. And in that moment, Ilara understood that this man's kindness was not born of pity, but of a shared, unspoken pain. It was a lifeline thrown not from above, but from the same dark waters in which she was drowning. The first few days were a blur of sharp, emotionally loaded silences. Ilara stayed in the bed, regaining her strength, while Silas moved about the cabin with the quiet, unobtrusive grace of a man who was used to being alone. He would leave food for her on a small table by the Bedmore broth, a piece of bread, with fresh butter, a baked potato. He never stayed to watch her eat. He would simply place the food down and retreat, either to the barn or out into the fields, leaving her to the company of her own thoughts and the ghosts that haunted the small cabin. The silence was a language in itself. It spoke of his grief and her shame. It was a wall between them, but it was also a space where they could begin to breathe. In the town, she had been suffocated by the whispers, the stares, the constant, suffocating weight of her disgrace. Here, in the quiet solitude of Shadow Ridge, there was only the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the steady, rhythmic sounds of a man at work. On the fourth day, she felt strong enough to get out of bed. She found her dress had been washed and mended, a small, clumsy patch sewn over a tear in the sleeve. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. She dressed and ventured into the main room of the cabin. It was meticulously clean, but stark. A man's space, a lonely space. She saw the rocking chair, the small wooden horse on the mantel, and understood. This was not just a house, it was a mausoleum. She found him in the barn, mending a piece of leather harness. He looked up as she entered, his hands stilling. He didn't smile, she suspected he hadn't smiled in years, but the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to soften slightly. "You're up," he said. I can't just lie there," she stammered, twisting a piece of her dress in her hands. "I need to earn my keep." The words felt inadequate, clumsy. How could she ever repay this man for what he had done? He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, the flicker of pride in her green eyes. He nodded slowly. The chickens need feeding, and the garden needs weeding. He pointed to a bucket of feed and a small patch of earth behind the cabin, where rows of struggling vegetables grew. He didn't offer to help. He didn't coddle her. He simply gave her a task, a purpose. It was the greatest gift he could have given her, and so began their strange, silent partnership. They worked. From sunup to sundown, they worked. Ilara, her body still weak but her spirit resolute, fed the chickens, weeded the garden, and slowly, tentatively, began to bring a woman's touch to the sterile cabin. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed the windows, letting in the bright mountain light. She found a stash of Sarah's old quilting scraps and began to piece them together, her needle flying, her mind finding a small measure of peace in the repetitive motion. Silas watched her from a distance. He saw the way she talked to the chickens, her voice soft and coaxing. He saw the way she would sometimes pause in her work and press a hand to her belly, a small secret smile on her face. He saw her transforming his house of memories back into a home, and it terrified him. Every small change she made, every bit of life she brought back into the cabin, felt like a betrayal of Sarah. And yet, there was a part of him that craved it, the smell of baking bread, the sight of a colorful quilt draped over the back of a chair, the quiet presence of another human being. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a dance of gestures and actions. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the porch for her in the morning. She would leave a hot meal on the table for him. In the evening, he chopped wood for the stove. She mended his torn shirts. It was a fragile truce, a delicate ecosystem of shared survival. One evening, he came in from the fields, weary to the bone, to find her sitting in Sarah's rocking chair, humming a soft, sad lullaby. The quilt she was working on was in her lap. For a moment, a hot, irrational anger surged through him. That was Sarah's chair. He opened his mouth to tell her to get up, to demand that she not touch his wife's things. But the words died in his throat. The setting sun cast a golden glow through the newly cleaned window, illuminating her face. There were tears glistening on her cheeks, but she was smiling. A real, genuine smile. She was humming to her unborn child. He backed out of the cabin silently, his heart a tangled mess of grief, anger, and something else, something he couldn't name. He went to the barn and slammed his fist against a wooden post, the sharp pain a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside him. He was a fool. What had he been thinking, bringing her here? He was just prolonging the inevitable. Soon the baby would come. And then what? She couldn't stay here forever. He couldn't. He couldn't replace Sarah. He couldn't replace Caleb. He stayed in the barn until the moon was high in the sky, wrestling with his demons. When he finally returned to the cabin, it was dark and silent. He expected to find her asleep in the spare room he had cleared out for her. But she was asleep in the rocking chair, the quilt clutched in her hands, her head lolled to one side. A plate of food sat on the table, cold and untouched. She had waited for him. He stood over her for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. He looked at her face, softened by sleep, the lines of worry and fear smoothed away. He saw not an intruder, but a fellow survivor. A woman who had lost everything, just as he had. A woman who was fighting, with every ounce of her being, to create a future for her child. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he gently lifted her from the chair. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, and her hand came to rest on his chest, right over his heart. The touch was electric. It was the first time a woman had touched him with tenderness in 5 years. It sent a jolt through him, cracking open a door he thought had been sealed shut forever. He carried her to her room and laid her on the small cot. He pulled a blanket over her, his rough fingers brushing against her cheek. He returned to the main room and sat at the table, eating the cold food she had left for him. It was the best meal he had ever tasted. As he ate, he looked at the wooden horse on the mantelpiece. For the first time, he didn't just see what he had lost. He saw what he had been given, a second chance. A chance not to replace his past, but to build a new future, a future he never thought possible. The struggle was far from over. The town with its judgmental eyes was still out there, and his own heart was still a battlefield. But as he looked around the small, quiet cabin, filled with the presence of this brave, broken woman, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, the whispers from redemption. Creek eventually found their way up the winding path to Shadow Ridge. They came on the wind, carried by the few souls brave or foolish enough to make the journey. A neighboring rancher, stopping by on the pretense of looking for a stray calf, let his eyes linger on Ilara as she hung laundry on the line, her belly now a proud, unmistakable curve. "Heard you took in some." "Charity, Silas," the man said, a smirk playing on his lips. Silas, who had been splitting logs, didn't pause in his work. The axe came down with a sharp, definitive thwack, splitting a large pine round in two. "I took in a person, Jeb," Silas replied, his voice flat and cold as a winter stone. "Something you might not recognize." Jeb, unnerved by the quiet menace in Silas's tone, quickly made his excuses and left, but the whispers persisted. They became a poison, seeping into the fragile peace they had built. When Silas rode into town for supplies, he was met with a wall of hostility. The mercantile owner served him with a surly reluctance. The sheriff watched him from his office, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Women would pull their children closer as he passed, their faces masks of pious disapproval. He's living in sin with that fallen woman, a disgrace to his dead wife's memory, and her with a bastard child on the way. What kind of man would take on such a burden? Ilara felt the weight of their judgment even from miles away. She saw it in the way Silas's shoulders tensed when he returned from town, the way the lines around his mouth deepened. She knew she was the cause of it. She was a stain on his reputation, a blight on his solitary life. One evening, as they sat in their usual silence, the tension in the small cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I should go," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't look at him. She stared down at her hands, which were twisting the fabric of her apron. "I'm causing you nothing but trouble. I can I can find somewhere else." Silas stopped cleaning his rifle, the oiled rag still in his hand. He looked at her bowed head, the shame that radiated from her like a heat haze. He thought of the town, of their smug, self-righteous faces. He thought of the past few months, of the quiet rhythm they had found, the way she had brought light and warmth back into his cold, empty house. He thought of the baby who would soon be born into a world that had already judged it. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice rough. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I can't stay here. I can't let them do this to you. You're a good man, Silas. You don't deserve this." He stood up and walked to the hearth, placing the rifle back on its rack. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What they think in that town, it doesn't matter. It's just noise. What matters is what happens here, in this house." He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out and gently tilted her, chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His stormy eyes were not angry. They were filled with a fierce, protective intensity that stole her breath. "This is your home now, Ilara," he said, his voice low and unwavering, "and no one is going to run you out of it. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. It was the first time anyone had ever stood up for her. The first time anyone had claimed her. She could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent promise passing between them. Then he dropped his hand and stepped back, the space between them once again charged with unspoken emotion. But not all of the community was against them. Small acts of kindness began to appear, like wildflowers pushing through cracks in a rock. The blacksmith's wife, a quiet woman who had lost a child of her own years ago, left a basket on their porch one morning. Inside was a soft, hand-knitted baby blanket and a loaf of freshly baked bread. There was no note. None was needed. An old trapper who lived even further up in the mountains, a man as wild and reclusive as Silas himself, stopped by with a gift of smoked salmon. He grunted a hello, handed the fish to Silas, and left without another word. These small gestures were a balm to Ilara's wounded spirit. They were a reminder that even in a place as harsh as Redemption Creek, there was still goodness to be found. They were threads of solidarity, weaving a small web of support around their unconventional family. The turning point came during a late autumn storm. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue all day, suddenly turned a bruised purple. The wind began to howl, a mournful, angry sound that rattled the windows of the small cabin. Rain came down in sheets, turning the dry earth into a sea of mud. Then came the hail, stones of ice the size of robins' eggs, hammering against the roof with a deafening roar. Ilara was in the barn, milking the cow, when the storm hit. She had been feeling unwell all day, a dull ache in her lower back that had steadily grown worse. As the storm raged outside, a sharp, searing pain shot through her, so intense it made her cry out. She dropped the milk pail, its contents spilling onto the hay-strewn floor. She clutched her belly, another wave of pain washing over her. The baby was coming, too soon. It was at least a month too early. Panic seized her. She was alone. Silas was out on the range, checking on the cattle. He wouldn't be back for hours. The storm was a raging beast, cutting them off from the world. She tried to stand, to make her way back to the cabin, but her legs wouldn't support her. She sank to the floor of the barn, the smell of hay and rain and fear filling her senses. "Silas," she whispered, the name a desperate prayer on her lips. As if in answer, the barn door was thrown open, and he stood there, silhouetted against the storm, his clothes soaked, his face a mask of grim determination. He had seen the storm coming and had ridden back as fast as his horse could carry him. He took one look at her pale face, the agony in her eyes, and he knew. He was by her side in an instant, scooping her up into his arms. "I've got you," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against the roar of the storm. He carried her through the deluge to the cabin, the wind tearing at them, the rain blinding them. He laid her on the bed, his bed, and began to work with a calm, focused urgency. He had helped birth calves and foals, but never a human child. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his composure, but he pushed it down. He would not let her see it. He would not let her down. He built up the fire until the cabin was warm. He boiled water. He tore strips from a clean sheet. He held her hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapped around hers, a solid anchor in a sea of pain. The hours that followed were a primal blur of agony and effort. Ilara screamed, she cried, she cursed the name of the man who had abandoned her, and through it all, Silas was there. He wiped the sweat from her brow. He spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her she was strong, that she could do this. He was her rock, her strength, her constant presence in the storm. In the darkest hour of the night, as the storm finally began to subside, a new sound filled the small cabin, a thin, reedy cry. The cry of a newborn child. Silas, his hands shaking, cut the cord and wrapped the tiny, fragile creature in the blanket the blacksmith's wife had left. It was a girl, a small, perfect, beautiful girl. He placed the baby in Ilara's arms. She was exhausted, drained, but her face was radiant. Tears of pain were replaced by tears of joy as she looked down at her daughter. "She's so small," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "She's a fighter," Silas said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Just like her. Mother." He looked at the two of them, this woman and her child, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. And in that moment, the last of the walls around his heart crumbled into dust. The ghosts of his past did not vanish, but they made room. They stepped aside to welcome this new, fragile life. He was no longer just a man haunted by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he had found. He reached out a tentative finger and stroked the baby's cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft. She was a miracle. A new beginning. A tiny beacon of hope in a world that had seemed so dark. He looked at Ilara, and their eyes met over the sleeping child. There were no words. There was no need for them. In the shared crucible of that night, in the heart of the storm, a family had been born. Not of blood, not of law, but of something far more powerful, of choice, of courage, of a love that had grown, silent and unseen, in the most broken of ground. The birth of the baby, whom Ilara named Hope, did not quell the town's gossip. It fueled it. Now there was a bastard child living up on Shadow Ridge, a living, breathing symbol of their sin. The sheriff, a man named Miller who saw the world in stark black and white, saw it as a personal affront to the moral order of his town. He had let Silas walk away with the woman, a decision that had gnawed at him for months. He would not make the same mistake twice. He found his opportunity in the form of Ilara's long-lost relatives. A letter, sent months ago by a concerned churchgoer, had finally reached Ilara's aunt and uncle in a more civilized part of the country. They were wealthy, pious people, horrified by the news of their niece's disgrace. They arrived in Redemption Creek on the stagecoach, their fine clothes and judgmental expressions, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn town. They had no interest in Ilara's well-being. They were interested in salvaging the family's reputation. And a bastard child was the ultimate stain. Sheriff Miller saw his chance. He met with the relatives, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He painted a picture of Ilara as a fallen woman, living in squalor with a brutish, unstable man. He suggested that the child, for its own good, should be removed from such an environment. He spoke of orphanages, of good Christian families who could provide a proper upbringing. The aunt and uncle, eager to wash their hands of the whole sordid affair, readily agreed. They signed the necessary papers, giving the sheriff legal authority to take the child. The final test came on a cold, clear morning, the kind of day when the sky is a hard, brilliant blue and the air is so crisp it hurts to breathe. Silas was out mending a fence line on the far side of the property. Ilara was inside, rocking Hope by the fire, singing the same soft, sad lullaby she had hummed when she was pregnant. A sense of peace had settled over the cabin in the weeks since Hope's birth. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken pain. It was a comfortable, shared quiet. They were a family in all the ways that mattered. The sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Ilara looked out the window, and her blood ran cold. The sheriff, flanked by 2 deputies and her aunt and uncle, was riding towards the cabin. She clutched Hope tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew why they were here. Miller dismounted, his face set in a grim, self-satisfied mask. "Ilara," he called out, his voice carrying an official, unyielding tone. "By the authority of the county court and with the consent of your legal guardians, I'm here to take the child." Ilara stood in the doorway, her body a shield in front of her daughter. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You can't. She's my daughter." Her aunt stepped forward, her face a pinched mask of disapproval. "Don't be a fool, Ilara. It's for the best. The child will have a chance at a decent life, something you can't possibly provide. This is her life." Ilara cried, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. With me. With us. Us? Miller scoffed, a cruel smile twisting his lips. There is no us. There's just you, and a man who took you in out of some misguided pity. This is not a family. It's a disgrace. Now stand aside. He took a step towards the door, but Ilara didn't move. You'll have to kill me first, she whispered, her green eyes blazing with a fierce protective fire. From the edge of the woods, a voice cut through the tense standoff, low and dangerous as a rumbling earthquake. That can be arranged, Sheriff. All heads turned. Silas stood there, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He had seen them coming and had circled around, using the cover of the trees. His face was a thundercloud, his stormy eyes promising a violence. That made the deputies shift nervously in their saddles. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the clearing, his gaze locked on Miller. This is official business, Blackwood, Miller blustered, his hand moving towards his pistol. Stay out of it. This is my home, Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than a shout. This is my family, and you are not welcome here. He raised the rifle, not pointing it, but holding it in a way that left no doubt he was prepared to use it. You have a piece of paper. I have a rifle. And I have a long memory of what this town does to people it deems unworthy. Now you have one chance to get on your horses and ride away. The air crackled with tension. It was a standoff, a battle of wills played out under the cold Colorado sun. Miller looked at the unyielding fury in Silas's eyes. He looked at the two deputies, who were clearly unnerved by the prospect of a gunfight with the legendary recluse of Shadow Ridge. He looked at Ilara, standing in the doorway like a lioness protecting her cub. He had expected a broken, shamed woman. He had not expected this. This fierce, unbreakable unit. He had the law on his side. But Silas had something more powerful. He had righteousness, and a willingness to burn the whole world down to protect what he loved. Slowly, grudgingly, Miller lowered his hand from his pistol. This isn't over, Blackwood, he snarled. Yes, it is, Silas replied, his voice flat. It's over. Miller stared at him for a long, hateful moment, then turned and mounted his horse. The deputies and the relatives, their faces a mixture of fear and thwarted ambition, followed suit. They rode away without a backward glance, their defeat hanging in the air like dust. Ilara watched them go, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. When they were out of sight, she sagged against the doorframe, tears of relief streaming down her face. Silas was by her side in an instant. He didn't take the rifle from his hands, but he reached out with his free arm and pulled her into a one-armed embrace, holding her and the baby close. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and leather and safety. It's all right, he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. It's all right. I've got you. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. You called us. You called us your family. A flicker of something tenderness, vulnerability, love passed across his guarded features. He looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, then back at her. That's what we are, he said, the words as simple, profound truth. In that moment, under the vast, open sky, with the threat of the world vanquished, they were no longer two broken souls bound by circumstance. They were a family, forged in the fires of adversity, sealed by a choice to stand and fight. He leaned down and for the first time, gently, hesitantly, pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. A kiss that tasted of dust and tears, of struggle and survival. It was the taste of home. They were married a week later, not in the cold, judgmental church in Redemption Creek, but on the land they had fought for, beneath the shadow of the mountains that had witnessed their struggle. The blacksmith and his wife stood as their witnesses. The old trapper was there too, looking on from a respectful distance. It was a small gathering, a quiet ceremony, but it held more meaning than any grand affair. Elara wore a simple dress. She had made herself, and in her hair, she wore a crown of wildflowers Silas had picked for her that morning. Hope, bundled in her hand-knitted blanket, slept peacefully in her father's arms. As Silas spoke his vows, his voice, usually so rough and guarded, was clear and steady. He spoke not of love as a fleeting emotion, but as a choice, a daily decision to protect, to provide, to cherish. When it was Elara's turn, she looked at this large, quiet man who had saved her, who had given her a home, who had fought for her, and her child as if they were his own. "I was lost," she said, her voice thick with tears, "and you found me. I was broken, and you made me whole. You and Hope... You are my world." That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they sat on the porch of their small cabin. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the gentle sounds of the evening. The rocking chair, Sarah's chair, was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a symbol of continuity, of the enduring power of love. Silas sat in it, rocking his daughter, his large, calloused hand resting on her tiny back. Elara sat on the steps, her head resting against his knee, her hand in his. The house behind them was no longer a mausoleum of grief. It was filled with the warmth of a crackling fire, the smell of baking bread, the soft sounds of a baby's breath. It was filled with laughter and light and the quiet, steady rhythm of a family's love. They had been two solitary, wounded souls, adrift in a harsh and unforgiving world. They had been judged, scorned, and cast aside. But here, on this small patch of earth, they had found their redemption. Not in the eyes of the town, but in the eyes of each other, they were broken. And now they were whole. And in the quiet of the twilight, as the first stars began to appear in the vast velvet sky, Elara looked at her husband and her daughter, at the life they had built from the ashes of their past, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was not just a new beginning. This was everything.